Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak at today's World Health Forum. My name is Alex Jack. I'm a macrobiotic teacher, counselor, author, and I work with Planetary Health, which is a macrobiotic organization based in the Berkshires. And we sponsor a variety of activities, including working to preserve the natural and organic food supply through non-GMO campaigns. We also involved in educational activities, including the summer conference that meets in the Berkshires each summer. Also, we have an online winter conference, which actually begins later this week, and other events online and in person. We also do a lot of publishing. We have a newsletter called Amber Waves, and also we do book publishing. And my lecture today will be on Ukraine, Seeds of War and Peace. And I'll be taking some of this material from a new book that I have just published, which just came out, called Spiral of History. Actually, it's an ongoing series which I began several years ago, and the current volume is number 6. And
Congratulations.
specifically with the age of ideology. And this refers to the early 20th century, you might say, from roughly beginning 1900 to the end of World War II. So it covers World War I and World War II, the ideologies of capitalism, communism, fascism, socialism, but also the more progressive movements of this era, including the women's suffrage movement, includes Gandhian nonviolence, and then also the foundations for macrobiotics with the teachings of George Osawa. And when I was working on this volume over the last year particularly, my initial feeling was that the great wars of the 20th century were primarily caused by rivalry for oil, for petroleum, which was now becoming the major fuel source, and then also that was for the quest for new colonies in Africa and the Middle East particularly, but to some extent Asia and Latin America. And that was my hypothesis. And I was completely wrong. That was not the motivation at all. It was a secondary, you might say, and very strong influence, but it was not the primary motivation. Primary motivation for World War I and World War II, in fact, the major wars of the late 19th century, including the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War at the turn of the century, was actually bread. It was the control of the world market for wheat, and the center, ground zero for that wheat supply for the entire world is Ukraine. And I was astonished. And so this morning, I'd like to share with you my discoveries because today, as we all know, Ukraine has moved once again into the center of global affairs. And it's a very fearful situation, dangerous situation that, as we know, can escalate into World War III, which very unfortunately would follow the patterns of World War I and II. So I'd like now to go into the share screen into a PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared. So just bear with me while we do that here. Okay, can you see the slideshow?
Yes, and Maybe if you double click on the image, it will get full screen. I'm not sure about that.
No,
Nope,
it
we're not.
got smaller. So is it pretty small?
Well, if you can find a full screen, it's nice. If not, it's okay.
Okay,
Or if someone out there knows how to do it.
okay.
All
Well,
right,
we'll make it a little
that's
bit
fine.
bigger. All right. All right, so this opening slide is simply a 19th century painting of the traditional harvest in Ukraine. And you can see the women here are using primarily sickles. It's interesting that traditionally the sickle was used by women and the scythe was used by men, representing somewhat of a gender difference. But the harvest was primarily traditionally by hand. And so mechanical cultivation, of course, began to come in a little bit later in the early 20th
What is the
century.
difference of a sickle and a scythe?
Sickle is a small a hand tool that you see on the Soviet flag and on the symbol of
Oh,
the
yeah. Mm.
Russian or the Soviet international communism. The scythe is a much larger full body type of instrument. And I used to actually have a scythe. I've used both, but a scythe is actually a wonderful tool for use out in the fields. And if you've ever read any of Tolstoy, like Anna Karenina or War and Peace, you know, there are whole scenes about scything, bringing in the crops, the wheat and the barley. And it's very much like Tai Chi because it gets the whole body moving. And anyway, it's a wonderful tool.
I don't mean to interrupt. This is Galina. I am from Ukraine. And the first smaller tool is somewhat of a semicircle looking tool with a small handle. The other tool, the bigger tool, is a lawn handle and more of a straight, a little bit straighter and bigger, just to give you a visual. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, the key to understanding Ukraine's significance is what is called chernozem. And this is the incredibly fertile black earth that yields a cornucopia of wheat, barley, and other crops, and now feeds much of the world. For millennia, it has been renowned as the most fertile, productive region of soil on the planet. At the end of the 18th century, Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, embarked on an ambitious campaign to invade Turkey, to seize Istanbul, the capital, and secure a deep water port to transport grain, the major source of Russia's wealth, from the steppes to the rest of the world. And to accomplish her goal, her Cossacks seized Ukraine, the most fertile region, and peasants and small farmers were brutally taxed to pay for her imperial ambitions. Catherine was foiled, however, by German monarchs who propped up the declining Ottoman Empire and blocked Russia from seizing the Bosporus and the Dardanelles Straits, the gateway between Europe and Asia. But Odessa, the wealthy city she built on the Black Sea in 1762, became the hub for future grain shipments to Europe. In the mid-19th century, Tsar Nicholas II again invaded the Ottoman Empire, and he sought to rename Istanbul Tsargrad and monopolize much of the world grain trade. But Britain and France joined the Turks in defeating the Russians in the Crimean War and ensured continuation of free trade of grain. By 1860, 700,000 wagon loads of wheat grown in the rich, black, fertile soil of Ukraine and Russia made their way each year along the black roads or the ancient wagon tracks of the steppes to Odessa. From there, the grain was exported by sea, where Russian warships had been banned. and ordinary freight rates to the capitals of Europe to provide food for the burgeoning industrial revolution. For nearly a century, the main staple of the industrialized world has been mass-produced white bread. It was made possible by technological advances in milling, first in Hungary in the early 19th century, and then worldwide. In Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, most of the flour came from Ukrainian and Russian wheat. Before the political revolutions in mid-century, common laborers in Europe ate dark brown bread or porridge as their principal fare. Bourgeoisie, including merchants, skilled workers, and administrators, ate a light brown loaf, while elites, including professionals and the gentry, enjoyed white bread. The introduction of fast, new mechanical rolling mills in Hungary revolutionized baking. They allowed white flour to be made and transported cheaply to industrial cities in Europe. And soon tens of thousands of bushels of inexpensive white flour flooded each day into Birmingham, Antwerp, and other hubs. Affordable white bread quickly found its way to the table of workers and their families. The bran, germ, and other nutritive layers of the wheat, stripped in milling, could be added to feed for cows, horses, and swine, an additional revenue source for the food companies.
And Alex, the idea is that it was found to be more tasty?
It was lighter, it was more tasty, and energetically, it was preferable for people who are eating heavy animal food. People who are eating meat, poultry, eggs, chicken, on a regular basis, they're not attracted to whole grains because whole grains are also on the yang side. So they like light, more refined type of grain. So in the West, that was bread or wheat. In the East, it was white rice. So that's been the pattern in modern times. All right. So in the early 20th century, however, the disastrous effects of refined flour, whether bread or rice, became apparent as the beriberi, pellagra, and other vitamin deficiency diseases spread. And then in the 1930s, this started to be replaced by enriched white flour or enriched white rice. Okay, the second greatest region of chernozem, the black earth on the planet, is in the Great Plains. Cheap American wheat transported by railroad to the east coast of the United States and thence by clipper ship to Europe began to outcompete European wheat and local economies in the mid-19th century. By 1850, US clipper ships could cross the Atlantic in 2 weeks, transporting southern slave-grown cotton in the holds and northern wheat as ballast. On return voyages, the ships carried hundreds of thousands of immigrants each year fleeing conscription, oppression, and starvation, especially after the potato crop failed. By 1869, Russian wheat shipped to major European cities through the Bosporus cost 25 cents a bushel. Although the distance and the shipping time were longer, it cost only 3 cents a bushel to ship a comparable amount of wheat from the American Midwest to Antwerp, Rotterdam, or Liverpool. 1 million tons of Russian and Ukrainian wheat passed annually from the Black Sea to the European ports. Comparable amount of cheap wheat from the American heartland and the Great Lakes crossed the Atlantic each week, or nearly 50 times as much. As grain prices in Europe fell about 50%, land or real estate values plunged, financial panic spread, and the great powers of Europe faced an existential crisis. The revolutions of 1848, the Paris Commune, and the rise of Marxism, socialism, and communism were a direct consequence or response to this food and agricultural crisis. From an economic angle, the United States Civil War broke out when the Northern Railway Cartel and farm associations formed the Free Soil Party and later the Republican Party to oppose slavery and to protect Western territories for wheat production. The Southern states wanted to extend slavery into the West to grow cotton, rice, and other plantation crops rather than wheat, and thus the issue came to a head. Though slavery was held to be immoral, the underlying motivation for its abolition was primarily economic. Slavery had impoverished millions of blacks and prevented the growth of a class of consumers in the South. Slave labor on cotton plantations also limited the planting of wheat, and the prospect of extending forced labor to territories and new states in the West undermined capitalist expansion. The railroads that brought grain to the South returned empty because there was virtually no manufactured goods for the consumers. Abraham Lincoln, a young railway lawyer in Illinois, recognized how slavery impoverished the country economically as well as morally. As president, he signed the Homestead Act, enabling millions of immigrants to settle in the plains and the West. Their principal economic activity was growing wheat for export abroad. Spurred by the Transcontinental Railway, food moved quickly and cheaply across the American continent. In the process of transporting cattle to Chicago to make beef and wheat to the East Coast for shipment to Europe, Native Americans were brutally uprooted from their traditional lands to make way for the railway or iron horses. At the time, the Great Plains was also home to millions of bison. Within a generation, the buffalo were nearly all slaughtered, Native communities uprooted, and the region turned over to producing beef and wheat for foreign or domestic consumption. The agrarian crisis threatened the great powers as they competed to control the wildly fluctuating food trade in Europe and to colonize the world. In the run-up to World War I, the future belligerents took increasingly aggressive measures to ensure food security, to expand foreign markets, and to compete with each other. So let's look at the main powers or belligerents. First, Russia. In response to Russia's high tariffs on grain, the German Chancellor Otto Bismarck closed capital markets in Russia to Russia in Berlin in 1887, and the enmity between the two countries steadily intensified. Denied a Bosporus outlet for the South, Russia embarked on an aggressive rail expansion to China and Manchuria to the east. The Tsar and the landed aristocracy dreamt of exporting wheat and other grains from deep-water ports in East Asia, but Japan's humiliating sinking of the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in 1904 thwarted this goal. Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War plunged the Tsarist regime into a financial crisis and psychological depression from which it never recovered. The revolution in 1905 followed, and the massacre of several hundred people in front of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg further alienated much of the population. In the face of another wave of food rationing during the Great War, Russian women marched for bread and peace. The October Revolution followed the March 1917 uprising, catapulting the Bolsheviks into power. The Ottoman Empire. is next. And thanks to British military intervention, the Ottomans survived the Crimean War with the Russians, but at the price of terminal indebtedness to London. Turkey continued to grow its own grain, but the hemorrhaging of wealth, foreign interest payments, and the import of cheap flour and textiles further depleted the tottering empire. To compensate, the Ottomans heavily taxed the outlying Balkan states, which were part of its empire, fueling independence movements in Serbia, Bulgaria, and Moldavia. In 1908, the Young Turks, a political reform movement, replaced the monarchy with a constitutional government, seeking to end the widespread perception of Turkey as the sick man of Europe and to reinvigorate the realm. Germany. Without its own vast grain lands, Germany focused on building deep water ports and subsidized railway to transport foreign pork, grain, butter, beef, and other imports. But cheap American food drove down the value of land and hence tax payments. Tariffs as high as 30% on inexpensive wheat from abroad brought in a flood of new revenues to invest in faster transportation, heavier industry, and other infrastructure. Bismarck's balance of power strategy largely kept the peace in Europe, but upon assuming power in 1888, Wilhelm II, the new emperor, changed course. Envying Britain and France's overseas empires, Germany sought to enlarge its own small colonial sphere. It rapidly started building battleships to challenge Britain's supremacy at sea, leading to an arms race at the turn of the new century. Austro-Hungarian Empire. The successor to the Habsburg dynasty and Holy Roman Empire saw its fortunes wane in the 19th century as consolidation efforts failed and a dual monarchy arose. The new mechanical milling process introduced in Hungary generated significant wealth and prosperity. By the 1880s, Russia and Belgium caught up and began producing cheaper white flour than Budapest. Despite a tolerant liberal attitude toward minorities of different languages and cultures, soaring nationalism further eroded its authority. Resistance was especially strong in the Balkans, aligning itself with neighboring Germany, which shared the dominant language and culture, offered Austria-Hungary the most direct path to survival. A further step toward global war was the growing alliance between Germany and the Ottomans. Prussian officials had trained the Turkish army since 1883, and 20 years later, German engineers started building the Berlin to Baghdad railway that would open the Persian Gulf to its African colonies and global markets. In July 1914, a dreadnought, a battleship of the largest and most powerful class of warships ever constructed, was set to be delivered to Turkey. Made by a commercial shipbuilder in Britain, the massive ship and its terrifying firepower had the potential to destroy the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. German control over the Ottomans could starve Europe of Ukrainian and Russian wheat and disrupt trade routes to the Arabian Peninsula, India, and beyond. In turn, a British blockade of the North Atlantic would starve Germany, which was dependent on American wheat transported by ship to Antwerp, Rotterdam, and other northern ports. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie by Serbian nationalists on June 28, 1914, was simply the match that lit the fuse of a war that would engulf the world. Over 100 nations engaged in fighting as a wave of unprecedented death and destruction swept the planet over the next 5 years. On the Western Front, the German invasion of Belgium and France, years of stalemate in the trenches, and the depredations of the U-boats and aerial dogfights by fighter planes engaged popular attention. In reality, however, the war was won and lost in the Bosporus in the east, and its fortunes changed as the fighting unfolded. Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Navy, bullied Britain into invading Turkey in 1915. The Gallipoli campaign at the mouth of the Dardanelles went down as the biggest military disaster of the war. The Turks repelled an Allied invasion of soldiers from Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, who found themselves virtually defenseless on the beachheads against rifle and artillery fire from the surrounding cliffsides. Altogether, casualties amounted to 350,000 men dead and wounded. To the east, the theaters of war swerved north to the Balkans and south to the Levant. Eventually, the Allies' blockade of cheap American wheat from reaching Germany through Antwerp and other northern ports led to widespread hunger and discontent in Germany. Following a naval mutiny in Kiel against the High Command, revolution spread to Hanover, Frankfurt, and Munich. The slogan, "Peace and Bread," soon galvanized working class support. Fearing the rise of a Soviet-style government, the German cabinet convinced Wilhelm II that the war was lost. Fleeing the country, the Kaiser abdicated his throne. A new constitutional state was formed, the Weimar Republic, and Germany surrendered. American infantrymen during World War I were fondly named the Doughboys. According to one theory, the term came from a popular flour dumpling eaten by British and American armed forces. During World War I, feeding the army and providing food relief to Europe assumed top priority by the Wilson administration, and millions of bushels of flour were rushed overseas. All the flour was refined, white flour from wheat grown on the plains and milled in the Midwest, and it contributed to the pale, dough-like countenance of the foot soldiers at the front. White bread had gradually displaced whole wheat, rye, and other whole grain bread now for nearly a century. The world wars of this era can arguably be said to have been won and lost by consumption of this new industrial product. In an article entitled "How White Bread Helped Win the Wars," the authors attributed the Allied victory in the Great War to the refining and processing of wheat. Quote, "It was simple canned white bread, standard among rations that the United States brought to the Allies. White bread that reinvigorated the exhausted forces. It was white bread that gave armies a sturdier food supply. It lasted longer and it stayed fresher than whole grain bread. And it was white bread that the half-starved denizens of occupied cities craved." In many a liberated town, as Time magazine reported, the first question asked of the doughboys was, "Where's the white bread?" The article goes on to claim that new enriched white bread helped win the Second World War in much the same fashion. In the beginning of the new 20th century, Europe and North America's desire for excessive yang food increased, and livestock producers, such as the ranchers in the western United States, Argentina, and Australia, could not satisfy global demand for beef. A further round of stimulants, pacifiers, and narcotics brought back by Western military expeditions to Cuba, the Philippines, the Congo, and India began to have devastating social consequences in the industrialized nations. Alcohol, a long-standing extreme balance to meat and other excessive yang animal food, grew out of control, and the movement to prohibit it spread in the industrialized countries because of its devastating impact on family life. Pasteurized milk became available, and the invention of the cream separator, the milking machine, and advances in commercial refrigeration launched the modern dairy industry. Between 1875 and 1915, sugar consumption doubled to 80 pounds per capita in the United States, and Coca-Cola and other soft drinks became widely available, with their popularity increasing with each new decade. From a biological perspective, World War I represented the explosive discharge of stagnant metabolic energy that had been accumulating in Europe following decades of dietary imbalance. The accelerating pace of modern life at this period reflected the increasing mechanization of the modern food and agricultural system, the advent of skyscrapers, the use of iron, steel, and glass as primary building materials, and the development of the automobile, luxury liner, and airplane coincided with the increasing use of metal and glass in canning, bottling, and other food packaging. When war broke out, these vehicles were transformed into tanks, battleships, and fighter planes. The multiplication of deadly striking power in rifles, machine guns, and artillery paralleled technological advances in white flour production, livestock fattening, and sugar refining. The introduction of poison gas on the battlefield directly followed the chemical adulteration of commercial food. The advances in the manufacture of ammonium nitrate led to the introduction of chemical fertilizer for farming and bigger, better, more devastating munitions. Okay, now let's turn to World War II. In Mein Kampf, his early memoir, Adolf Hitler laid out his blueprint for world domination. Like most leaders of his era, he was a social Darwinian and convinced that there was a hierarchy of races, with Scandinavians and white Anglo-Saxons, or what they called Aryans, on top, followed by lesser races, including the Jews, Slavs, and blacks at the bottom. As a superior race, he believed the Germans were destined to control Europe and the world, beginning with the conquest of Ukraine and the seizure of the chernozem, or fertile wheatlands. To obtain Ukraine, which had become part of the Soviet Union after World War I, Hitler had to invade Poland and then defeat Russia. The living space the Germans needed was known as Lebensraum, and this was the foundation of the Greater Reich he vowed to create. The Jews were anathema to Hitler because they believed in people's common humanity, a sentimental notion in Hitler's view that flew in the face of Darwinian dogma that life was a permanent struggle for survival of the fittest. Centered in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, whose Communist Party he regarded as Jewish-controlled, Hitler declared the Jews had to be cleared from the black soil to make way for a superior race. When the idea of deporting the Jews to Siberia and Mozambique fell through, the Nazis turned the slave labor concentration camps into death camps. Shockingly, Hitler modeled the extermination of the Jews, the Roma, gays, disabled, and other targeted groups on the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans. In Mein Kampf, he wrote, quote, "There is only one task, Germanization through the introduction of Germans, and meaning to the Black Earth area, and to treat the original inhabitants like Indians." And on the eve of the Holocaust in 1941, he said, "Never have I heard a German who has bread to eat express concern that the ground where the grain was grown had to be conquered by the sword. We eat Canadian wheat and never think of the Indians," unquote. He also admired American eugenics, the science of racial breeding, that had already sterilized thousands of undesirable American women, mostly poor and Black. Interestingly, Adolf Hitler turned vegetarian several years before becoming Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Until then, he had eaten conventionally. But as an artist and a music lover, he was inspired by Richard Wagner, the 19th century German opera composer, who was a noted vegetarian animal lover and anti-Semite. Hitler's meatless diet did not appreciably change his way of thinking or behavior, and in the end, millions of people were exterminated for an ideological delusion and buried in the Black Earth. So I want to take a moment just to look a little bit again at the dynamics, because this brings a very interesting subject to this study, is the role of vegetarianism, not only in World War II, but throughout history. And while it's definitely a very small minority, it is still something that we need to understand. The leaders of the Spanish Inquisition, for example, were for the most part also vegetarian. And as Christian ascetics, they strictly avoided meat and ate very, very narrowly. Their persecution of the Jews at the very end of the first turn of the spiral of history, which the first turn went from roughly 3200 BCE to 1500 CE, or the beginning of the Renaissance. Hitler's persecution of the Jews came toward the very close of the second turn of the spiral, which lasted from 1500, the Renaissance, to roughly 1980, the beginning of the digital revolution. And so they occurred at exactly the same juncture, a very tragic example of history repeating itself. But it was not only in the West where this happened. In the Far East, we also find fanaticism among vegetarians. And particularly, for example, one example was in the East, in Japan, where after the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji emperor encouraged the country to adopt a Western diet, heavy on meat and dairy products. And many traditional communities in Japan, including Zen Buddhists, were militantly opposed to this. And one group tried to assassinate the Meiji emperor by setting off bombs in the palace, and they were foiled and executed. But anyway, that kind of extremism has now and then appeared. Today, we find that vegan extremism in some quarters, bombing factory farms in the name of animal liberation. So it's important to understand that when we look at War and Peace, that its diet is extraordinarily important, but vegetarian or vegan diet is not in itself a guarantee of peace. And I'll just say a little bit further about this because it's important to our larger understanding about spiral of history overall, and that the key really is balance, and that history shows that a plant-based diet does in fact dramatically reduce the outbreak of violence and war. There's no question about that. But while ideal ethically and spiritually, giving up meat or animal food completely or becoming vegan, in my view, is not necessary. And there have been several major civilizations that observed a mixed diet of plant and animal food and flourished peacefully for a millennium or more without warfare, without personal violence. Once a culture or civilization, however, exceeds the ideal 7-to-1 ratio of plant to animal food, which correlates, for example, with the 28 teeth for chewing grains and vegetables and the 4 canines for eating animal food, its health and consciousness decline. It perishes through self-inflicted ecological catastrophe, through epidemics of sickness of its own making, or defeat by a superior force. And much of my work in the last several years in the Spiral of History series has been devoted to exploring what I call the 5 peaceful civilizations in world history. These include the Minoans in the Aegean and the Mediterranean, the Niger River Valley in West Africa, the Indus River Valley in Pakistan and northern India, the Norte Chico, the first civilization in South America, in the Andes, and the Aboriginal Australians. In contrast, the 9 warlike or wrathful civilizations were the ones that spread the ethic of warfare, as well as patriarchy, monarchy, and all these other types of systems that have contributed to the present crisis. And those 9 warlike civilizations include ancient Sumer in the Mesopotamia region, ancient Egypt, China, Vedic India, ancient Israel, Greece, Rome, and then the high Mexican civilizations, Maya, Aztec, and the Inca. Anyway, that's a very interesting study in itself, but we'll leave it at that for right now. Okay, so let's now turn again to Ukraine, particularly after Second World War. Okay, so Ukraine continued as a republic within the Soviet Union after World War II. More than 700 cities and towns and 28,000 villages were destroyed in the war. Famine broke out in 1946 and 1947, caused by drought and the wartime destruction of infrastructure. And tens of thousands of people also perished. Chairman Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union gave Crimea to Ukraine, I think it was in the early 1950s, to promote friendly relations and set the border that was then later violated about 10 years ago when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. In 1986, the worst nuclear reactor accident in history took place at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Following the liberalization in the USSR under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union started to decline, and in 1991, Ukraine declared its independence. A recession and hyperinflation followed in the 1990s, giving rise to a class of powerful oligarchs who dominated the country, as in Russia and as in other former Soviet republics. In 2014, as I just mentioned, the Russo-Ukrainian War broke out, and Russia seized and occupied Crimea. And then this past February, almost a year ago, Russia invaded Ukraine with the goal of incorporating the entire country back into the Russian Federation. Okay, so this past year, Ukraine once again became ground zero for potential World War III. And as I think most of us know, the war in Ukraine has imperiled the lives of up to 2 billion people in the Middle East, Africa, and other regions dependent on wheat from this region as their main staple. Until the blockade, until Russia lifted the blockade in an international agreement last year, all grain from Odessa, including the wheat used by the United Nations humanitarian projects around the world, was bottled up and could not leave the Black Sea and make its way down the Bosphorus. But this time around, the wheat threatens to be not just refined or enriched, but also genetically engineered. The United States controlled World Bank and the International Monetary Fund about 10 years ago forced Ukraine to accept GMOs in return for loans. President of Ukraine, who at that time was a vassal of Russia, refused, and he turned to Putin for aid, precipitating deadly protests leading to the current crisis. Western agribusiness started to buy up the chernozem, or the black earth, in Ukraine in order to sow GMO seeds, both legally or illegally. And about 10 years ago, Amber Waves, our macrobiotic newsletter, we published actually a booklet entitled, "Will Ukraine Become the New GMO Capital of Europe?" We're warning against this approaching catastrophe. Okay, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, over the last 10 years has led a non-GMO campaign in Russia. And although Ukraine has a Jewish president, Putin assailed its government as neo-Nazi. The introduction of GMOs in Ukraine, however, is no excuse for Russia to invade the country, to uproot millions of people and plunge the world into a nuclear crisis. Yet the emergence of biotech food in Ukraine is deeply worrisome. GMO wheat could lead to a sharp decline in global health and further dimming of planetary consciousness. Fortunately, Monsanto's plan to introduce GMO wheat in America's chernozem heartland in the Great Plains was decisively turned back, thanks in part to our grassroots Amber Waves network and macrobiotic friends around the world who joined us about 15 years ago. However, this summer, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved GMO wheat from Argentina. The grain trade that Russia has interrupted has led agribusiness companies to step up their campaign to develop new GMOs to, quote, feed the world, unquote. I might add that just this past month, I interviewed a Ukrainian woman in Canada who had fled Ukraine and who came from the Black Earth region and was telling me about how they would, her garden and her parents' garden and so forth, and how, in recent years, representatives of the agribusiness companies have been handing out GMO seeds, but they refuse to grow them, fortunately. So this is a very troublesome development. Okay, I'd like in the last part of my talk this morning to look a little bit at the lifestyle and diet of particularly of Vladimir Putin to help give us some insight into why he has taken such aggressive action. In the latest defense of his bloody invasion of Ukraine, Putin called in a speech for partial mobilization to defend the motherland, and he rattled Russia's nuclear arsenal, warning, quote, "Those who are using nuclear blackmail against us should know that the wind can rise and turn around," unquote. So there's been tremendous speculation about why Putin invaded Ukraine, because it's been such a disaster for Russia. And a lot of it turned on whether he was sick or gravely ill. And oligarchs and past associates and underlings whisper and post on the internet that the Russian president has cancer, Parkinson's disease, or other serious mental or psychological disorder. However, rejecting these rumors, CIA Director William Burns last summer lamented that Putin was, quote, "all too healthy," unquote. Despite some weight gain and puffiness over the years, Putin appears relatively healthy, and he eats a fresher, much healthier diet than most world leaders. He enjoys buckwheat porridge for breakfast every day. He partakes of salads and fruit. He prefers fish to meat, and he drinks beet juice, kvass, and other healthful Russian beverages. Several years ago, he led a campaign, as I mentioned, to prohibit GMOs in Russia and to promote organic gardening and farming. Putin is also very sportive and prides himself on being fit and trim. Practices judo, he plays ice hockey, climbs mountains, races cars, and dives in fish. Despite his healthy diet and lifestyle, Putin has grown more confrontational with the United States and NATO in recent years. From actively cooperating with the West at the end of the Cold War, he is transformed into an imperial ruler who embraces a mystical vision of an expanded Mother Russia and compares himself to Peter the Great. After Biden called him a killer on an ABC News interview program nearly a year before the Ukrainian invasion, Putin immediately challenged him mano a mano, or man to man, as some media outlets reported, to a live debate. 1 week after invading Ukraine last February, Putin again rattled his nuclear saber, quote, "Whoever tries to interfere with us should know that Russia's response will be immediate and will lead you to such consequences as you have never experienced in your history," unquote. As the war dragged on over the next 6 months, he repeatedly challenged the West. In televised remarks last summer, he stated defiantly, "Today we hear that they want to defeat us on the battlefield. What can you say? Let them try." In the face of Putin's relatively healthy diet and lifestyle, it has remained a mystery why he has acted so belligerently. Unless, like Hitler, he was the exception that proved the rule, in the sense that his diet was relatively balanced. Over the years since assuming power, news reports indicate that Putin has taken therapeutic baths in the blood extracted from the antlers of Siberian red deer. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu of Russia reportedly introduced him to this traditional remedy in the mid-2000s. Soaking the blood drained from the deer's sawed-off antlers reputedly rejuvenates and improves many conditions, ranging from enhancing male potency to reducing arthritis and joint pain, retarding hair loss, and delaying aging. The treatments involve immersion in a shallow tub filled with warm blood in sessions that last from 8 to 30 minutes over 5 to 10 days. On trips to Siberia, Putin has reportedly taken such baths, though the Kremlin has never officially confirmed them. When I started researching and came across this, multiple reports, both in the Soviet press and kind of the underground press, it was very clear to me, why he was now so belligerent. From an energetic perspective, relaxing in such a testosterone-filled medium and absorbing the antler blood into his cells and tissues would help explain his aggressiveness and his fighting spirit. Male deer, known as stags or harts, engage in seasonal fights with their antlers to establish dominance over females. The rutting season begins in the autumn and lasts through the winter. Curiously, the Ukrainian crisis began in March and April 2021, when Biden made his remarks on Putin being a killer. At the end of the rutting season, when thousands of Russian troops were first mobilized near Ukraine and Crimea. A partial withdrawal followed in June and July 2021 during the rutting off season, followed by massive deployment of 100,000 troops on borders again between October and December, when the rutting season resumed. The end of February of last year, the peak of the new rutting season began, and Putin invaded Ukraine. As the ICBMs rolled through Red Square in early May, Putin addressed the annual Victory Day parade in Moscow, defended his invasion of Ukraine as necessary to protect the motherland. In his worldview, Mother Russia plays the role of the hind or female deer in the competition for global dominance. From his antler blood-soaked perspective, Ukraine is the alpha doe in the herd. The other does to be reunited in his harem are Poland, Georgia, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, and other former Soviet states and satellites. Putin's sparring, strutting, grunting, and roaring seem to arise from this red deer blood-soaked therapy. After a lull during the summer, again in the off-season, Putin suddenly lashed out again on September 21st on the equinox and invoked the motherland 4 times in his speech. As a macrobiotic counselor, I would strongly encourage Putin to stop the deer bloodbath, cut down on meat and sugar, and observe a balanced whole food plant-based diet, and to unblock his central channel and reawaken his conscience, or the still small voice of balance within. Palm healing, shiatsu, and acupressure would also be very beneficial. Natural dietary and way of life changes such as these would help him recover his inner compass, bring an end to the war in Ukraine, and contribute to world peace. All right, so that pretty much concludes my presentation for this morning. And I hope you can see the thread there from white bread, World War I, enriched white bread, World War II, to the potential for GMO wheat, and hopefully not World War III, but a very dangerous present day crisis. All right, so I'll get out of the screen share here and we can go into the Q&A mode. Okay, any comments or questions?
Of course I do. 1 second. There is a quote by the, let me just see who is, Israel's envoy to India. His name is Naor Gilon. And he says, the Israeli diplomat in India explained, Jews have lived in India for over 2,000 years in total equality and peacefully. I was surprised at how much love and appreciation there is in India towards Israel. It says there is no anti-Semitism in India. There is no anti-Semitism in India. This phrase just doesn't exist. So it's interesting to me to think about India, that the whole subcontinent, really their basis of food is rice, whether white or whole, not just the North, right? So I'm just wondering your understanding, your response, your comments about that.
Well, my immediate reaction to that, I don't know too much about the history of Judaism in India, but I know a little bit about the history of Muslim in India, and India is one of the most anti-Muslim policies in the world, and it has one of the greatest sources of hatred. The caste society in India is the worst in the world. I mean, I could go on and on about the prejudice, discrimination, and in India, yeah, you can. I studied in India for a year. I've lived it firsthand. It's atrocious. There's nothing that can be said for it. Gandhi, when he led the Satyagraha, the nonviolent movement in India, he always said that his #1 goal was to end the caste system in India. He says the British colonialism paled in comparison to the native prejudice among Indians. So I don't know that the traditional diet in India has contributed to greater harmony at all. I think on the contrary.
So how can we understand that in this case? I can understand that largely, well, Japan as well, I guess, or the Far East. It's such a rice-based diet. Well, no, I don't know. I'm just kind of talking through my head here because America was
Well,
grain-based for a while too.
yeah, I mean, this gets into, yeah, very interesting territory because it's true that, I mean, as Michio Kushi and George Osawa and our macrobiotic teachers taught, that traditionally throughout the world, people were eating whole grains, and for most people were relatively peaceful and harmonious. Problem is that in the historical era, going back thousands of years, the elites that emerged, for the most part, were eating substantial animal food. So, and very early on, they were started eating refined grains. So even in China, for example, we find the health reformers, at the time of before Lao Tse and Confucius, talking about the elites eating white rice and complaining about that. Because they were eating heavy animal food. And when you eat heavy animal food, you want light grain. You don't want heavy grain, right? I mean, even people today, macrobiotic friends, are eating fish. That they typically will have white rice when they have fish rather than brown rice, because it's an energetic balance there. So anyway, throughout Asia, unfortunately, its history has been every bit as violent as Western history. And white rice for centuries now has been the staple, certainly among the elites, and then by emulation among ordinary people in China for almost now 200 years, in India, perhaps less so, Japan certainly even more so. So I would not consider these Eastern countries as examples of peaceful countries by any means.
And if we go back thousands of years?
Thousands of years, yes. You have the Jomon culture in Japan, which was the traditional culture, very peaceful culture, which went on for 20,000 years or more. Its main grain, well, there was no cultivation. The main grain, of course, was millet at that time. Rice came in from China and Korea, gave rise to the imperial dynasty, and which the original, one of the earliest dynasties was Queen Himiko, the empress, which was peaceful, but after that it was patriarchal and warlike. In China has been pretty much warlike throughout its at least historical era for 5,000 years. India, you have wonderful, several golden ages in India associated with Buddhism. The first one was with Ashoka around 3 or 4 century BCE, and then in King Harsha in the 4th century AD. Those were truly golden ages in which both monarchs were great war heroes and conquerors, but after they came into power, they renounced warfare, became Buddhist, and created golden ages, and both became vegetarian. And anyway, those are wonderful examples in the historical era, 2 of the greatest from India and worldwide. So there are pockets like that in the more recent historical times. And then in the Middle Ages, by far the most peaceful culture was Muslim in the Arab cultures. And of course, they took in Jewish refugees throughout that whole period from particularly from Europe, because they were being persecuted by the Christians. So in Andalusia and Spain, you had, for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, it was a very peaceful era in the late Middle Ages among Jews and Muslims and Christians, and to some extent in other parts of North Africa.
Okay, we have another question. Clara, did you want to ask directly? Michelle, you have a question as well. Clara,
I
did
had a
you
quick
want to?
Can you read it for me, please? If you're not.
Sure. Clara is asking. Hold on, I lost it because there's a lot going on here. Okay. So, Alex, if you thought that my question was difficult, here's a better one. What would motivate Putin to eat differently than he does?
Well, as I said, I don't know that the diet is the main factor with Putin. I think it's his external remedies in terms of soaking, in deer's blood. I mean, male deer are by nature combative. So when you're taking in that energy, you become combative. It's very simple.
My question was, and act differently.
Yeah, so I think that would be the number one step that he should take. I mean, it's very curious because Putin's ex-wife is reportedly macrobiotic and who went to conferences and so forth in Western Europe. And so he probably has some knowledge. And I guess his anti-GMO activities and what he said on organic is, one of the best of all the world leaders. Whereas in this country, very unfortunately, the Biden administration, has been, very neutral or even anti toward organic and toward GMOs. They just approved, they're now trying to force GMO corn back into Mexico, the Biden administration. So this is really quite horrible from a health point of view.
Okay, Clara.
But no. But is there anything that would motivate him to be different? Is there any forces by anybody? Obviously, his wife is his ex-wife, so that doesn't help.
Well, that may make it worse, I don't know. I mean, I'm hopeful because the Russian people are, have a lot of common sense, and most Russian people don't want war; they want peace. And there's a tremendous anti-war movement in Russia, which is, underground or, it's being suppressed as soon as it surfaces. But I think there's a yearning for peace in Russia, and a lot of the Russian artists and people in exile themselves are speaking out against the war. So I think there may be a movement, some pressures, particularly this coming year. For those of you who know anything about 9-star key, you may know that this coming year, Putin moves into what's called the Ankansatsu position, in which he's very ripe for some kind of strong, unexpected disaster from behind. So I don't want to speculate, that this would be a coup or conspiracy or whatever, but his energy is such that he's very liable to experience something from that, from within the Kremlin or from the, who knows what could happen. But he's in a very vulnerable position this coming year after February 4th, the New Year's holiday.
And what has been his position this past year?
This past year, he's in his home spot, which is 3-tree. He's 3-tree, very idealistic, but very stubborn. And so he believes, very, very sincerely that, he's being encircled by NATO and by America, and there's some truth to that. And that, he's readdressing the balance. But, and there's that element within Russian society, kind of a mystical resurgent czarist type of element that he's now catering to, and which, wants to relive the glories of the czarist era. And so, even if he were to leave the scene, his successor might be worse. That's the other unfortunate option. But we'd like to think that most Russians want to live in a, in a global, multicultural economy, and so anyway, let's see where it goes. On the other hand, I've been somewhat critical of Zelensky in Ukraine. I mean, he set an amazing example of courage during the Ukrainian war, and he's rallied his country, rightfully, but he often goes too far, like taking the war into Russia. He sent drones into Russia, and he's killed Russians. You know, he's expanded the war. He's called for American and NATO involvement militarily and so forth. This is all very, very dangerous and could spark very easily a World War III. And his energy, interestingly, he's a 5 soil. And anybody who knows about 5 soils knows that, you know, they bring either war or peace. They either create tremendous unification or destruction. So as much as I like a lot of what Zelensky, his character and nature and courage, he has to be careful about going too far. And again, if you look at his diet, he's certainly not macrobiotic or vegan or plant-based. So this is a worrisome.
We have 2 quick questions. That's said ironically. One, can you explain the history of anti-slavery in relation to grain or to bread? And the other one, I'd like to know the history of sugar.
Okay.
Thank you for your extended historical interest.
Okay. All right. So yeah, interestingly, the subject of slavery, I actually wrote 1 or 2 of my books on, mostly devoted to the transatlantic slave trade and to some extent the Asian slave trade. Yeah, this is a really interesting topic, but at least the Western slave trade in Africa, you know, began with the Dutch and the English, and essentially as increased animal food was being eaten in Europe and particularly in Britain with agriculture, what they called at that time the agricultural revolution in Britain, in which they were fattening up cattle and they were enclosing the cropland. And so grain was being displaced by animal food. They were looking for a natural balance to meat, which of course is sugar. And so initially slavery in Africa was to enslave the Africans to make sugar plantation. Well, sugar didn't grow very well in Africa, but it grew wonderfully in the Caribbean. And so that led to the transatlantic slave trade. And about 90% of it was devoted to growing sugar in the Caribbean and South America. Only about 5% of what we call the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere was in the continental United States, you know, in Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia and so forth. And that was for growing primarily rice and then later cotton, because again, sugar didn't grow very well in that climate. But it was just a simple yin-yang balance, meat and sugar, meat and cotton. And interestingly, the abolition movement that began in Britain and the United States against slavery was led by primarily by vegetarians, by plant-based people, by proto-macrobiotic people. Almost all of the leaders were doing that. They boycotted sugar because they didn't want to eat sugar that was grown with slave labor, and they were not eating animal food. So they were able to, you might say, what we call a conscience, which is just the flow of heaven and earth's energy. They were able to pick up on that, whereas animal food blocks that energy, so you can't feel it. And then if you're too lean, you know, you can't properly assimilate it. So I think that's the story of slavery and sugar.
Alex, Jack, can you just say you said too yin? Is it yin? It blocks it? Is it you say yin?
I say it doesn't block it, but it disperses it, so you can't actually, you know, take it in properly. Yeah.
Oh, so animal food.
Animal food blocks it. Sugar disperses it. So in other words, you can't receive the signal. You know, you have to have some yang quality to receive it. If you're too yin, you're not going to receive it.
So interesting. Thank you.
Alex, I couldn't quite understand the position of the southern states and the northern states in what in your presentation of what you described, that was related to growing wheat, and that the
Yeah.
reason why the north. So can you expand what that means? I couldn't quite understand.
Yeah, okay. Around in the 1850s or leading up to the Civil War in 1860, 1861, there was a national debate about the West, which except for, I think, California, there were no states and there were territories. And the question was whether slavery, which was in the South, would be extended to the Western states or not. And the slave states wanted to extend it there in order to grow cotton or rice, because those were the great slave crops. But the northern industrialists wanted to grow wheat in the West. And to grow wheat was not something that you needed slaves for. It could be grown by individual families. And that's the same pattern throughout Asia. For example, wherever you have wheat grown, it's always grown by individual families. Where you have rice grown, it's always grown by cooperatives or communes or extended families, because rice requires, tremendous group effort. So there was a huge debate in this country, and so economically, that division between the planters in the South and the free soil, as they called themselves in the North, and essentially economically, that was what the war was about. And Lincoln was a lawyer for the Northern Railway and wheat interest. That doesn't detract from his deep abhorrence of slavery in any way, but just economically, there was that whole level or layer that most of us are not aware of.
Thank you, Alex. This was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
We have one last question. I think this may be the last one. A listener is asking your thoughts on the explosive popularity of quinoa as on a moral basis.
Yeah, quinoa was traditionally grown in the Andes, in the high Andes, and it has been consumed for thousands of years. Of course, it's become very trendy in recent times and is now available and eaten kind of all over the world. And what I've heard is that it's now become unaffordable for many people in Bolivia and in Ecuador where it's grown. So I think from a moral spiritual point, this is tragic. Unfortunately, it's the same kind of commodity agriculture that's found all over the world, where certain crops have been grown and then exported, and the traditional indigenous agriculture has suffered. So that in Africa and other parts of South America, Asia, and so forth, the whole economy is geared toward these rich commodities like coffee or like bananas or like mangoes, or in this case, quinoa, that is then sent to the wealthier countries in Europe, North America, or now Asia and the Middle East. So this is tragic. So yeah, so I think people who refrain from eating quinoa, for moral or spiritual reasons, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
And we have a post-final comment, Carol. Did you want to speak, Carol, or raise your hand?
Yes. Alex, it's Carol Raftis. This was absolutely beyond spectacular. I'm going to give you the Macrobiotic Academy Award. Oh, thank you, Alex. I could listen to you forever. It's so well done and just such profound insights. And we're just so blessed to have you. And thank you. And of course, for Gnat as well. So thank you again, Alex. Oh, boy. Wonderful.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you,
Yeah.
Carol. Thank you, Gnat. Just in closing, if just mention again, we are holding our online winter conference. It starts this Wednesday for 4 days. We have, I think, 15 or 20 sessions. We have a wonderful lineup. And you can see the schedule on our website, planetaryhealth.org. And some of you I know will already be there, have already registered, but there's still a few more days. And also you can check out, well, the books that I just mentioned, Spiral of History. We have an online bookshop, and we have many other books in our newsletter and so forth. So if you get a chance, please check it out, and be nice to see some of you later this week. Okay.
Alex,
that.
is there a summer conference already in planning? Do we know what the dates would be?
It's still up in the air. We haven't decided yet on the summer conference. The last 3 have been online, so it's unclear whether we'll meet in person or continue online. But we'll decide after the winter conference.
I would love to be in person, but I understand. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Alex.
Yep. Thank you.
All right.
everyone.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Hi, David. Thank you
Yeah,
so
hi.
much, Alex. Yeah, it was terrific. I appreciate your sharing your time with us, your wisdom, and your dedication. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gunnar. Thank you.